so that we can say we did. Okay, there are a couple of things that I wanted to do before we sort of jump into things proper. One of them is just a reminder for anybody who might be interested but might have forgotten. If you are not yet registered to vote and want to vote in Oregon, you have until October 13th, which is next Tuesday. Just a reminder on that. Also on the summary, the little summary of Module 2, the sort of journal that I've got set up, almost no one has used that yet. That's okay because we just started the module, but just I'm reminding you that it's there. It's easy to forget that. And remember that those little journal summaries or whatever you want to call them are for your use. It allows me to see how people are understanding the material because I make notes from that, and then I can make sure that maybe I need to recalibrate or re-explain something when I come back to the next class. But they're primarily of use for you in order to be able to do this strange and mysterious midterm that I think I finally finished. And it's absolutely brutal, by the way. It's really, it'll kill you. I think the median grade in here is going to be what we all are, which is slightly above average. I'm looking for a lot of C pluses. How many people believe what I just said? All right, then. You know me better than that. All right. You know, everybody's like, I've never had a class with this guy. Is he a psychopath? Well, I am, but not that kind. So don't worry about that. Yeah, again, just a reminder there. Now, does anybody... so far, I'm assuming that not only have we discussed it, but I'm assuming that as responsible adult university students, you've all had the chance to take a look at that very, very brief introductory chapter from Reinhardt. Does anybody have any questions on either a discussion or anything else that you noticed when you were reading through Reinhardt that we need to talk about here, or does it seem to be pretty clear? What do you think? I think it's pretty straightforward, but again, you know, that's about the 40th time I've read that chapter too. So that's not really fair.
When Reinhardt defines the different types of colonialism.
Yeah.
You know, there was settlement, trade, military, and the third one was like collaboration, some sort of
sort of full-on colonial occupation.
Yeah, occupation, subjugation. Yeah. Where would the like attempts to straight up enslave a population fall under?
I don't know what you mean by straight up enslave. I can't think of an example in modern times when that's happened.
Well, the only thing I can think of is British and to an extent Spanish colonialism back in 18th century, I think.
I'm not sure that's accurate though. Who were the British enslaving?
They're trying to they attempted to enslave the American Native population, and it just didn't pan out well.
No, they didn't. No, that's not accurate. There was no consistent policy from the Crown to make slaves of Indigenous Americans. That wasn't official policy. Remember that most of that was kind of left to the colonizers. It was left to the people who were on site. Now, if they got into problems, they could ask for help from the British, you know, the British Army or something, or a ship from the British Royal Navy or something like that. But I don't know that I've ever encountered, and maybe I've missed this, Graham, maybe you've come across something I haven't yet, but I don't know that I've ever come across a specific, you know, enumerated policy of the British Empire actually to institute a full-blown slavery of an indigenous population like that. AJ, did you have your hand up? Did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, you mentioned the Spanish a little bit there, Graham. Are you talking about like the encomienda system, like the early Spanish stuff where they'd lump all the natives under a single colonizer and then he'd get to do whatever he wanted with their labor, like that big missionary system? Because that kind of makes some sense to me as like enslaving a population, and I'm wondering if that's where you're trying to go.
I mean, I understand that falls more under the subjugation, the third category, and I think the British colonizers' attempts to enslave American Indians, that doesn't fall under official policy, I guess. So it would just fall under settlement, the second.
Yeah, except even there, it was not a consistent policy even throughout the original colonies. It just wasn't. You know, I mean, there was an extraordinary amount of I guess, sovereignty of each of the colonial possessions, largely because, as a couple of you've already pointed out, and we're going to talk about that somewhat today with the example being the scramble for Africa, where a lot of these colonial adventures were really driven by commercial enterprises. And some people have justifiably asked the question, well, is that the same as colonialism if it's really not driven by the state? And the response to that is admittedly problematic, but I think it would have to be that in every one of those instances where the possessions were maintained, that was only because ultimately the state took charge of those things. And again, the classic example there is sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in the run up to and after the Berlin Conference and the so-called scramble for Africa, where if you go into parts of East Africa and Southern Africa, you'll find that a lot of, you look at people like Cecil Rhodes and people like that, he wasn't a part of the government. He was just a guy who wanted to make money, and he would go and negotiate these usually very disingenuous deals with indigenous rulers, and they were trying to exploit his capacity to their advantage. And so he ended up sort of personally possessing some of this territory, and yet he did not embody the British state, and in many ways got in the way of what, you know, the larger empire was trying to do. You could even argue that that was the case in the American colonies, that many of the things that the colonists did were inconsistent with what the British Empire would have wanted them to do. And every once in a while, there would be, you know, this extraordinary tension between the colony and the core or metropole. Never mind the colonized, just tension between the colonizer and the core. Okay, in terms of using slavery or enslaving an indigenous population, I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm saying in modern, most of the colonial examples we're going to be looking at, you don't find that, because it doesn't really fit into an industrial model. You know, the notable exception to that, oddly enough, would be what we might call sort of internal colonialism in a way, if you really wanted to do this, and that would be the Nazi death camps and the use of slave labor, you know, under the Nazi regime. You know, that's one of the last times where we saw a modern industrial country in the 20th century explicitly and avowedly using and relying upon slave labor. Okay, it's just not, it's one of those things that you just don't see as much anymore. And a lot of that has to do with prevailing international law, you know, having to do with any kind of forced conscription, any kind of involuntary servitude, things like that, and transporting slaves and things like that. You know, I would remind you that by the early 19th century, Britain had disallowed slavery, and in fact, the British Royal Navy was intercepting vessels involved in the Atlantic slave trade and liberating the slaves and things like that. So again, I don't know that it's really accurate to talk about the British Empire as having in its colonial possessions a systematic policy of enslaving the indigenous population. I'm not saying there was never any forced labor. Of course there was. I mean, every empire has used forced labor at one time or another. But the idea of slavery is that you are making that permanent and institutional, that you're creating a permanent institutional relationship where you have an absolutely captive population. Okay. I mean, we know that during the Second World War, the Japanese used slave labor to build railroads in Asia. We know that. Not only did they use captured British troops, but they also used indigenous slave labor. Okay. But it wasn't that the policy of Japan was to enslave people. When Japan went into Southeast Asia, you know, they didn't immediately create some sort of institutional slavery. We know, though, that in Korea, there were elements of slavery in terms of what the Japanese military was doing there with the Japanese people. Graham, it's a great point. I don't know if I'm helping you or not, though, you know?
I think that was responsive.
Okay, yeah. Let me think a little more about that. That's an interesting observation, though, and I just want to think a little more about that. All right, one of the things that I'd like you to do between now and next week is I got some homework for you. Okay, the first thing that I want you to research is something I'm just going to do a little flyover of today. Okay, and it's this notion of the scramble for Africa. And what I want you to do a little research on is what's called the Berlin Conference of 1884. It went into 1885. Okay, now there's no longer really a scholarly consensus on just how important the Berlin Conference was. Some scholars of African history or of imperial history argue, really it had impact, but it wasn't the kind of decisive imperial moment that people claim, where suddenly then it unleashed these imperial forces in sub-Saharan Africa. The primary function of the conference, as you'll find out, was really to try to avoid war over colonial possessions. But look into that a little bit, because the reason for that being, this is a multinational attempt to rationalize empire as a sort of organic part of great power, adversarial competition. That, the French and the Brits and also the Germans and maybe the Portuguese and the Spanish or whoever, they're going to fight over territory. Let's see if we can mitigate the consequences of that short of total war. Okay, so look into the Berlin Conference. It's one of those things that, partly because SLU does not have an African history class, hopefully at some point I'll be able to teach that. A lot of people don't know what that is, and they don't know how that relates to the last great stage of colonial empires in sub-Saharan Africa. It only affects, obviously, sub-Saharan Africa, but it takes advantage of a certain state of international law. And that's what I want you to kind of look for. Let me tell you why, okay? One of the things we're going to start talking about from now on is something that I first introduced in my collective action class, okay? And the concept, as I understand it, originates in sociology, okay? And it's a concept of what are known as opportunity structures, okay? So another thing I'd like you to do a little research on is, and there are some good online sources for this. Sorry, I have really quickly to respond to my program chair so that I can get him off my back. I'm really sorry, but let me do that really, really quickly. All right, sorry about that. I really apologize. But we had a thing come up here and we have to deal with it. And I just realized that I hadn't responded. It's my fault. Okay, anyway, this notion of an opportunity structure, that is, at any given time, there's an institutional or structural environment within which actions take place, okay? And when you talk in terms of opportunity structures, what you're saying is, well, we're going to look at, for example, the history of organized labor, or the history of feminism, or the history of resistance to slavery, or in this case, the history of colonialism, or more importantly, the resistance to colonialism. And what I want you to start thinking about is, what were the structural things in the environment in that time? The institutional processes, the accepted norms and values, the structure of domestic or international law that would facilitate or could be used to the advantage of not just the colonizer, but in fact, even though those things might be imposed by the colonizer, they could and were used by the anti-colonial forces in the resistance to colonialism. Okay, in other words, many times what we recognize as opportunity structures are inadvertently advantageous to the opposition. First of all, I'm really serious about this. If that doesn't make sense, I will try to explain it better. But do you understand what I'm asking you to look for? Okay, for example, there's a perverse kind of opportunity structure in education that is brought to the colonized by the colonizer, okay? And you might ask, well, why would you want to provide education to people who are subject to colonial rule? Aren't they just your cheap labor and stuff like that? Why would you, we're getting way ahead, but I think let's just stretch out a little bit. Why would you want to educate at least some of your colonized population? Just whoever has a comment, just blurt it out.
To use them to help you get the other people to cooperate.
Yes, that's something that's so often neglected in the study of colonial structures and institutions. And it's a great point. That is, what you want, and Reinhardt talks about this, Kennedy talks about this, all these people talk about this, is inevitably, if you want a colonial dominion to survive, you have to have a collaborator class from within, okay? One way to do that is to educate them, because remember, it's not just teaching them mathematics or even teaching them your language. What education does, as you all know, being victims of it, it inculcates certain kinds of prevailing norms and values. This is what it means to be, a British subject, or this is what it means to be an American, or this is what it means, to be French or whatever. And it can really stimulate, at least in a minority of your population, what becomes ultimately a colonial elite, right? That is an elite among the colonized, who are more likely, as a consequence, not merely of what they know, but of the westernization that they experience through colonial education, they might be more likely to support the colonizer, because that's where they derive much of their benefit. They may derive their wealth or their prestige or their security from the colonial administration. They're being offered a job they would never have had in a pre-colonial environment, okay? That's an opportunity structure. That is, it's instituted and formalized and made at least semi-permanent by the colonizer, but ultimately, as we will see in many cases, it is the source of some of the most informed, complex, sophisticated resistance to colonialism. Almost never do you find a case of a sustained, for example, sort of illiterate peasant revolution of any kind. There has to be, in every case we can find in history of any scope, right? There's an educated core elite. They are often educated in the structural values of the colonizer, and then turn those against the colonizer because now they know how the colonizer works, right? They understand, here are their strengths, but here also are their vulnerabilities, okay? That's something that becomes very important. So it's one of the reasons why, for example, in American slavery, it was overwhelmingly the case for most of the existence of American slavery not to teach slaves to read and not to educate them. Okay, it wasn't just the belief that they couldn't be educated, it was the fear that they could, right? So think about that, how when you do that, you're creating, whether you mean to or not, you're creating what I'm suggesting we can think of as an opportunity structure. The same kind of things that facilitate peculiar episodic advantages to any kind of movement were present in every case of particularly successful anti-colonialism. Okay, so I want you to just you can start by Googling, but just nose around a little bit. Use the Hannon Library and look in ProQuest and look as a search term, just put, in quotes, opportunity structures, or in quotes, put, Berlin Conference or Scramble for Africa, and see what the scholars are saying. Try to get off of Google and Wikipedia a little bit, but they're not a bad starting point. And I know because I've looked up the Wikipedia page for the Berlin Conference, and the Wikipedia page for even the one for opportunity structures and things like that. They're there. But remember, you're in a university here. You're trying to dig a little deeper. You're majoring in political science. See what the scholars say and how they use that. Because what I'm trying to get you to think about is not just, oh, I kind of know what the term is, but rather, oh, I understand why Hughes is using it. That might not be what I would choose, but I get why he's using it. He's trying to help us look at the phenomena that we associate with colonialism and anti-colonialism from a particular vantage point, because he's convinced that's going to teach us something, or it's going to reveal something that might not otherwise be evident, okay? So I want you to look at those two things over the weekend to start with. The 1884-85 Berlin Conference and this concept of opportunity structures, okay? All right, any questions on that so far? I don't mean to be rushing through, it's just that we don't have a lot to do today. But I'm going to be setting you up for some work to do so that we'll have things to talk about on Tuesday. And I figure that's the trade-off. If you're not spending as much time here, it's because I want to give you more opportunity to do other things. Now, in terms of people I want you to look up, there are two. So there are ultimately four things I want you to look at. And I just mean look at. One of them, and I'm not going to tell you who these people are, okay? I want you to do the work. One of them you are familiar with. I've already mentioned him several times, and that's Frantz Fanon. Because there is no single individual beyond Karl Marx, whose own writing, and more importantly, whose own action was more influential on anti-colonial struggles than Frantz Fanon. Because Marx was an abstraction. Now, it was a valuable and dynamic and important abstraction, and indeed, ideologically, an opportunity structure for anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. Okay, but in Fanon, we find someone who grew up in the regime of the colony in Martinique, all right, ultimately ends up in Algeria, publicly a part of one of the most violent anti-colonial revolutions we've seen, okay, and he's writing about it, okay, and of course probably his most prominent work is Wretched of the Earth, or it could be Black Faces, White Masks, but I think it's Wretched of the Earth. He wrote a great deal in these volumes, and they're very dense and they're very intensely expressed, and they're very much emphasizing the psychology of resistance and the psychology of struggle. Okay, fascinating stuff. That's one. The other one you're going to know probably not at all. I think I've only mentioned him a couple of times. It's a guy by the name of Albert Memmi, M-E-M-M-I, first name A-L-B-E-R-T, Albert Memmi. Okay, but he wrote a book. I can't reach it from here, or I would, and it's called The Colonizer and the Colonized, and he wrote it in the 50s. And I know for a fact that one of the people who read it was Frantz Fanon. Okay, so that's why it's kind of interesting. But also, as a narrative, he's giving this really fascinating narrative. My recollection is that he was in Tunisia. Okay, and he's writing from the perspective of both a European and a Tunisian, and he's got, again, that kind of hybrid experience that is often associated with the forces of resistance, okay? And so he wrote this fascinating book, and I would, if you want to get an interesting perspective on that isn't quite as psychologically intense, that's somewhat more dispassionate than what you're going to read in Fanon, I would say that Albert Memmi's Colonizer and Colonized is quite good, and I picked up a used copy of it for like $5. So it's if you can find it, it's out there. And if we were meeting on campus, I could just make the book available to you. That was my original plan when I didn't realize that we might still be, working remotely. But so I want you to look at, obviously, Berlin Conference, Opportunity Structures, Albert Memmi, Frantz Fanon. Okay. Now, again, if you look at the Moodle page, they're all mentioned there. Okay. I mentioned the colonizer and the colonized, Memmi, and then the psyche of the colonized in Frantz Fanon. Fanon is not interested in the colonizer because the colonizer for him is that ultimate other. When we talked about alterity, that's very much built into Fanon's analysis. By the way, when I use that term alterity, have we comfortably discussed that, or do we know what they're talking about and why that would be so important to a colonial regime? Okay, great. All right, so any questions on any of that? Because then we're very briefly going to talk about the Rogue Empires book review, just by way of giving you some insight into the Scramble for Africa. I think, if I'm mistaken, I apologize, but AJ, I think it was you who in our last class brought up the commercial imperative of a lot of this. I think that was you, but I might be wrong. And I had said at the time that, one example of that, at least I think I did, was the Scramble for Africa. If you look at this, it's a very brief, I think it's a 3-page article, okay? And sometimes I've found when I'm doing preliminary research, rather than go and look at a book, even if I think it's interesting, I'm going to look for book reviews and find out, well, what do other scholars say about this? Because they're going to help me to decide whether or not this is likely to be of use to me. Okay. And I found that, I haven't read the Rogue Empires book yet because I haven't been able to find an affordable copy, which for me is, I'm sorry, these days is anything under $10. But eventually I'll probably read it. Okay. It's a little formal and a little stuffy for me, but it's quite useful in terms of just looking at the Scramble for Africa. The main part of the thesis here that we're emphasizing is this idea of kind of commercial sovereignty, okay? That there was a period of time where international law was still in that kind of laissez-faire, realm of kind of, well, go forth, get the territory, all that. And one of the little loopholes of international law was that, you know what? Anything that's like, in quotes, foreign territory, meaning white Europeans aren't inhabiting it, it's yours. If you can go there and you can establish a presence and stake a claim, it's yours. And it isn't like this, I claim this on behalf of, the King of England or something. It's yours, you own it, okay? You can, and if there are people living there and you can negotiate a deal with them and they'll do business with you, that's fine. You can establish, usually it was a trading company of some kind, some sort of mercantile enterprise, right? Some commercial enterprise. But this wasn't the same thing, for example, as the 17th and 18th century charter companies that were created by Britain, like the original British East India Company, for example, was created under a charter by the British government. Okay, a lot of the organizations that founded the initial colonial possessions in the United States were in whole or in part were commercial charters that were at least recognized by the crown. Okay, but by this time you've got this, you've got these people who have, the merchant class has achieved ascendancy by the 19th century. Okay, and they're able to go out to these parts of the world. They're able to hire and equip their own expeditions and go out and occupy these places. And, often it starts out with something like looking for the source of a great river or something like that. The idea being, you now have, more opportunity to discover things of commercial value or of anthropological value or archaeological value, but usually, of course, of sort of commercial value. And so the original Scramble for Africa is driven largely by that. And it predates the Berlin Conference because, you've got these people who are going out there and saying, well, I'm here, this is mine. Okay. And then, then maybe they have investors. And so they charter as a private trading company or something like that. And on behalf of that, you send these adventurers out there and they usually bring a journalist along with them or something like that. If you read Arthur Conan Doyle's book, Lost World, that's a classic example of this. It really is. That narrative is based on the kind of private, in this case, academic adventuring group that was typically going out into the world to discover and claim things. Okay. And that's what was going on, particularly in Africa. That's exactly what was going on. The problem with that is, well, you tell me, first of all, what are the advantages of that? Having private companies go out and do that. Yeah, AJ.
The crown doesn't have to front the cost and they can deny a little bit of responsibility if it goes wrong.
Yeah, because if it goes wrong, you can blame it on the company and say, well, we had nothing to do with that. Okay. And it could be very, very expensive to continue to outfit, to mount these expeditions and explorations. And if somebody with private capital was willing to do it, the crown and the parliament were initially, at least, were more than happy to do it. Kyle, do you have your hand up? You've got.
Oh yeah, I was just saying it's a lot easier because you don't really have to go through any bureaucracy.
That's
There's a
right.
lot less there's no oh, I have to sign this document, make sure it's okay with this part of the crown and that part of the crown. You just have some dude go for you and
right.
Take a ship.
Exactly. And what happened, particularly after the Berlin Conference, was that this was still going on, but increasingly what was happening was that very, sort of anti-bureaucratic freedom that a lot of these commercial enterprises had tended to leave the door open for all kinds of chaos and destabilization and excess and violence and mistakes and fraudulence and all kinds of things. And what ultimately would happen was when one of these private expeditions would go wrong, people could say, well, the crown could say, parliament could say, we didn't send them out there. It doesn't matter. They were British. And it starts to make the whole imperial adventure look bad. Okay, because, every once in a while, somebody brings back a report that some atrocities were committed or some great loss of dignity of the British people or the French or whoever, was committed because these commercial people didn't know what the hell they were doing. And therefore they disgraced, that country or its people or its reputation or something. And so gradually, in fact, ultimately pretty quickly, the governments of the various European states, began to see that there was not only commercial, but strategic value in these expeditions and these possessions, but also that you could not trust these business people to be good administrators. Maybe they had the audacity and the initial capital, the venture capital, to go into these places and to explore them and to acquire this territory. They couldn't administer it, and they couldn't protect it. Private armies aren't reliable at this time, and so gradually you had the metropoles investing in these commercial enterprises, chartering them formally under the government, under the auspices of the government, which among other things often included sending troops, created by the government in the service of the government in order to occupy and protect these territories. Okay, things that the private trading companies could not do. Okay, so that's what's going on in this book. Is the author is explaining that process of this is how it worked. This is how it started. It was largely a sort of a private Wild West kind of commercial enterprise. And ultimately it became taken over and sort of rationalized, however imperfectly, by the governments themselves. Yeah, AJ.
So is that related on page 6 of Reinhardt? There's a section where he basically talks about how the colonizers kind of inadvertently ended up taking over Africa in that sense, like this kind of like they stumbled into it. And that's what they're talking about there. That kind of confused me in Reinhardt.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I included this article in this discussion was so that remark that he makes would make sense.
Right. So those are just like they kind of stumbled into military interventions that they kept. It just didn't make sense to me. So yeah. Okay.
Exactly. It's one of those things that when we say empire, we don't think about, for want of a better term, inadvertent colonialism or something. It's not, I mean, that's almost a comedic way of thinking about it, but it was the idea that they'd feel like, oh my God, what are we going to do now? Well, wait a minute, we better send some forces in there and, let's charter this thing. And which obviously means we exert some control over it. We also legitimize it. We have our own negotiators. The other thing that was happening at this time was that in this struggle over territory, you might have a French commercial venture that was investigating, around what became Côte d'Ivoire, for example. But, kind of next door to that, you're in like Benin or whatever, you might have the Brits. Well, they're going to encounter each other. And that's probably not going to end well. And so the idea was, it was left to the metropole governments to negotiate those conflicts. And so it was putting this chaotic pressure diplomatically. Because again, the concern is if you can't resolve this, it could lead to war. Because by this time, we're talking about the end of the 19th century. Europe is essentially an armed camp. Okay. The argument is Europe was an armed camp and Britain holds the scales, right? And there was something to that. That was, by the way, the old balance of power notion, that there were these powers that needed to be balanced. The equilibrating scale was Britain, the British Empire. And so it drew these government diplomats on behalf of their governments into these negotiations, these commercial negotiations, frantically trying to avoid war. Okay. And so that's part of what the Berlin Conference is about, and the movements after that. Okay. So that's that's the main thing I wanted you to take a look at. I don't want to dwell on it too much because, you can read the thing and you can figure out what it means for you, but it gets back to kind of the point AJ was making, that Reinhardt drops in there, but doesn't really in fairness, he elaborates on it in the book, in the whole book, but that's the risk of having just the introductory chapter, is this idea of kind of stumbling into a colonial possession or thinking, or for example, after World War I, you have Germany, displaced from its attempt at colonial possessions. Well, somebody's got to take those over and administer them. They didn't make them independent, right? And so some of them were protectorates. That was a phrase that Americans like to use, a protectorate, but we got it from the British. They were realizing that calling something a colony not only was sometimes considered to be kind of primitive, kind of maybe pejorative, kind of negative, but also if you called something a protectorate, we could say it was, we have to go in and colonize and govern here just to keep these people safe. That became the moral imperative. It was sort of the logical extension of the civilizing mission, which is they're surrounded, the barbarians are at the gate outside their territory here, and we can go in and we can protect them, So they are our protectorate, because we're just noble chaps, going in there to protect them, as it were, that kind of thing. Well, we were actually, Leah, I think you came into class late. We were already talking about the gaps in international law that made dubious claims of sovereignty by any but those who could back it up at the barrel of a gun. And obviously that did not include any colonial possessions. That was what triggered things like the scramble of Africa that we've been talking about. It's a good point, and it reminds me to clarify that, was that one of the opportunity structures, right, then would be this ambiguity in international law with respect to what it meant to claim sovereignty over territory that was just deemed foreign, okay? Never mind that there might be people living there. Okay, so that's a problematic aspect of empire in general, particularly in the colonial projection of economic and political and military power. That can be problematic. And ultimately, of course, particularly after the Second World War, one of the purposes of the UN Charter was to further pursue this notion of rationalizing the real estate of the planet in such a way that we didn't really facilitate that we could insofar as it disadvantaged the United States in particular and the West in general, we could sanction that, and indeed, it's been relatively rare since the Second World War that particularly in the Western world, we have seen a sovereign country come in and just simply claim and possess a territory. And most recently, of course, that was the Crimea. Even if you don't count Ukraine, you'd have to count Crimea. And it's been that long since something like that happened. And that's why it's strange that more people aren't still talking about it. That for all of our talk about Russia, it seems only to boil down to Donald Trump and elections, when in fact, nothing's been done. I mean, the sanctions are not hurting Russia so much as low oil prices are. If oil prices were high, sanctions wouldn't matter that much for them. But one of the purposes of the UN Charter, sort of the end of the game for us, was to rationalize all this stuff, which in turn kind of, negated old style go out, occupy, and dominate colonialism. Okay, that's where we're ultimately heading with the class. That is, it eliminates what were opportunity structures for colonial empires in terms of what Leah just reminded us of, those gaps in international law. Does that make sense? All right. I didn't want to keep you too long today because I think even though, those are both short readings, the ideas and the material are kind of complex. There's some moving parts here that I want you to have a chance to think about. One of the things I'm hoping is that the research you'll do in those 4 areas that we were talking about is going to help you rationalize and figure out how some of those things fit together. Again, the 1884-85 Berlin Conference, the general concept of opportunity structures, and then the 2 writers, Memmi and Fanon, okay? And again, Memmi's last name is spelled M-E-M-M-I. It's on, by the way, it's on, if you can't remember, it's on the Moodle page, along with the title to his book. And I also just found his book to be a fascinating read. I really did. And Fanon is one of those reads that will simultaneously exasperate and inspire you in some ways, depending on how radical your predisposition. Because he can be just maddening to read sometimes. And yet there's a beauty and a power to his prose that compel you to set aside whatever your resistance to his ideas might be and think, he's allowing me to look inside the heads of the people he's talking about. I don't know another writer who does that. Okay, certainly not a European writer. They can't. Okay, so that's why Fanon has been so important to that period of anti-colonial struggle after the Second World War, is because he gave an insight into at least what he believed to be the psychology of resistance, specific to colonialism. But I have found, at least as an analyst of colonialism, to be quite useful. Okay, for all that I have problems with some of his remedies and some of his psychiatry. Okay, all right. So is there anything else? Yeah, Kyle.
One last question, kind of going
Sure.
back to the Reinhardt piece. He says, like at the beginning, I think like page 1 or page 2, that decolonization is also a phenomenon in which colonial rule is replaced by the spread of the modern state.
Yeah.
Does he mean like properly like a nation state at that point? Like, is that the
Can you say that again, because you're a little bit distorted there?
Sorry. he says that colonial decolonization is defined by replacing the colonizer by the state. Does he mean the nation state as understood by like the European conception of it?
Yes, in fact, the point he's trying to make there, and again, this is the downside of having a very, very brief introduction to a much longer book, is what he's trying to say is the institutional arrangement of the colony, okay, gave way to the propagation of new nation states,
Oh, okay.
the formation of new nation states. And also this is kind of where he talks about what he calls the subcolony. You'll hear him make reference to subcolonialism or the subcolony. That is, you can have an emancipated colony like the United States became, for example, that itself will engage in what we could argue to be internal colonialism. That's what he's arguing, okay? And so ultimately, internationally, once you have, you know, the ratification of the UN Charter and the reconfiguration of recognized legitimate international law, okay, the old notion of the colonial possession isn't eliminated. They don't go away, okay? But we don't see them propagated, but also we see the status of many of those colonies transforming radically, okay? Where the colonizer, for various reasons, leaves, withdraws. Remember, they didn't want to. It's a myth, it's a mistake to assume that colonialism ended. And if you've begun Kennedy, you'll know that he's pretty emphatic about this. Colonialism wasn't benevolent. It was inevitable. And those are very different things. But what it left in its wake, however imperfectly, was some attempt by the colonized to enter the newly formed or expanded notion of that realm of legally, juridically recognized nation states. That's ultimately where he's going with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the idea is that they get to now enter the world system, basically,
The problem, yeah, it's not the idea they
as a
get
nation
to,
state.
it's now they have to. There's no alternative.
Well, I guess that's fair. I mean,
Yeah.
it feels like, I don't know. I feel like the states that are put out of that might be disadvantaged in a series of ways. Like if you aren't recognized by other states, like
That's right.
Taiwan not being recognized by the or something like that. Right?
Yeah, I didn't mean to contradict what you were saying. I was trying to look at it as there were two sides to that opportunity
Yeah.
structure. The
Yeah.
nation state
I guess that's
itself,
fair.
as an institution, becomes an opportunity structure
Yeah.
for those seeking to leave colonialism, right? It's a promised land for them to be a sovereign, recognized, internationally acknowledged nation state and have that guaranteed right to sovereignty and self-determination, right? That's the good side of it. The bad side of it is that they now have to try to survive in the economic and political and military and geopolitical realities of the world of nation states.
Yeah. They're kind of thrust into that, like the rest of the responsibility, or not necessarily responsibility, but the rest of the interactions with other actual nation states.
That's right.
As opposed to being in a little colonial shell.
Exactly. And what we often forget about, you know, the United States, for example, is that arguably we became colonized with Europeans in the early 17th century, okay? We didn't really become, you know, even nominally independent until the end of the 18th century. So we had the better part, more than a century, you know, to establish our own institutions, our own localized constitutional governments and things like that. We had a lot of time to do that. And also, for the most part, although there was significant influence from the crown, you know, there was a certain degree of semi-sovereignty of colonial people that clearly did exist by the middle of the 18th century. It became problematic, but it existed, largely governed by the merchants of those various colonies, okay? In most of we had, for example, a fairly large educated class. You know, the percentage of colonials who were educated was not unlike the percentage of people in Britain who were educated, you know, in that sense. And literacy rates were relatively high and things like that. We had fairly robust, albeit localized economies. We had shipping, we had trade, we had massive textile production and all these kinds of things, so that we were really well poised to enter into the world of nation states economically and, if not militarily, certainly economically, okay? In the case of the very rapidly liberated, you know, colonial possessions, you know, in Asia, Africa, places like that, They didn't have those institutional infrastructures in place. They were just kind of, it's like taking a child of 15 and saying, okay, you're on your own. Or worse yet, taking a child of 9 and saying, okay, you're on your own. Well, I don't know how to do this. Well, your brother did it. Yeah, but my brother was 18 when he left home. And he'd finished school, and he'd had a couple of, summer jobs, and he knew what he was doing. I'm 9. I just learned to tie my shoes, man. Come on, give me a break. I mean, there was that as well. Yeah. By the way, that notion of the international, the deeply embedded, deeply institutionalized system of sovereign nation states becomes very important to the historical moment of the end of colonialism as we knew it. Okay. For some of what Kyle is implying, if not suggesting explicitly, in terms of opportunities and challenges and strategies of anti-colonialism, the idea of having as a model the sovereign nation state becomes very important. Anything else? I mean, yeah, there's always a lot, but I mean, is that enough to be going on with for your weekend so that I don't spoil it? Okay, good. And I would remind you once more that do take advantage of that journaling for this, if you want to call it that, for this module. I understand there are brief readings, but like if you find good notes on Memi's work, you find good notes on Fanon or something like that, that's the place to put them, because then I can see what you're thinking on the pages, and then I know, okay, when I go into class, next Tuesday, I better talk about this. Okay, that's a point that one of you raised, but others of you have not put in your notes. Let me run with that a little bit. It actually, if I have insights into what you're working on individually, that can actually help me refine the class. And it's something I've never tried before. So far, though, it's worked really well for those of you who are keeping notes. All right, anything else? All right, great. Then I will see you, I assume I will see all of you on Tuesday. All right. Have a good weekend.